What if everything you believe about modern China is wrong? Before the internet, before communism, before the fall of the last emperor, an entire civilization was quietly rewriting the rules of love, marriage, and desire, generation after generation, in ways almost nobody outside China ever fully understood. Over the next few minutes, we will travel across more than a century, from 1912 to 2026, to discover how Chinese sexuality was crushed, hidden, reborn, and finally exploded into the open. And the biggest transformation of all happened far more recently than most people think, closer to our own lifetime than to the fall of the last dynasty. This is a story of emperors and revolutionaries, of silence and rebellion, of censorship and curiosity, and of a civilization constantly negotiating between tradition and change, one household, one law, and one whispered conversation at a time. We will begin in 1912, the moment the last dynasty collapsed and a new, fragile republic was born out of chaos and uncertainty. Then we will explore the May 4th generation and their fight against arranged marriage, the devastation of war and civil conflict, the strict new order under Mao Zedong, the shocking silence of the Cultural Revolution, the slow, cautious reopening under Deng Xiaoping, the explosive freedom of the early internet age, the rise of smartphones and dating apps, and finally the strange, contradictory China of today, caught between heavy censorship and a booming, hidden sexual culture. By the end, you will understand why China's story is not one straight line moving steadily toward freedom, but a century of extremes, reversals, silence, and quiet rebellion repeating itself again and again, era after era, generation after generation. Stick around, because the final chapter of this story might be the most surprising one of all, and it might hit closer to home than you expect, no matter where in the world you happen to be watching from right now. For over 2,000 years, Chinese sexuality existed inside a rigid framework built on Confucian family duty, ancestor worship, and social hierarchy. There was no real concept of romantic choice the way we understand it today. Marriages were arranged by parents and professional matchmakers, often negotiated years before a couple ever actually met face to face. Female chastity was demanded and enforced through law, custom, and community pressure, while wealthy and powerful men could legally keep multiple concubines alongside a single primary wife. Sex itself was treated less as personal desire and more as a family obligation tied directly to ancestry, inheritance, and social order. There were no elected governments, no modern courts, and no written constitutions questioning any of this. Foreign visitors who arrived in China during the late 19th century often described a society where public and private life were governed by unwritten but rigidly enforced expectations, passed down through countless generations without serious challenge, and reinforced daily by family elders, local officials, and the weight of tradition itself. But then, in 1912, an emperor stepped down from the throne for the last time in Chinese history, and a fragile new republic was born from the ashes of empire, and one single political collapse would eventually change everything that came after it. But when the republic was officially declared, a new generation of students, writers, and reformers looked at this ancient system and saw not sacred tradition, but a prison built specifically for women. Newspapers, pamphlets, and early feminist writers began openly questioning why marriage had to be arranged at all, and why women alone carried the burden of family honor. New schools for girls opened in major cities. Foot-binding was formally banned by the new Republican government, and a small but growing class of educated women began imagining careers, travel, and romantic partnership on their own terms for the very first time, something that would have seemed almost impossible to their own mothers just one generation earlier. But something unexpected happened. These early reformers were still a small, urban, educated minority, and the vast majority of rural China continued living almost exactly as their ancestors had for many previous generations. And that wasn't the biggest change. Just 7 years later, an entire youth movement would explode onto the streets of Beijing and change the national conversation forever. But that wasn't the biggest surprise waiting in this story. What came next didn't just challenge tradition quietly from the sidelines. It dragged the whole debate directly into the streets, the universities, and the national press. In 1919, the May 4th movement erupted, driven largely by students furious over foreign humiliation after the First World War and eager to modernize China from the ground up. Sexuality quickly became a genuine battlefield of ideas among the educated youth. Chinese intellectuals translated the work of Western thinkers, including Havelock Ellis and Sigmund Freud, introducing entirely new language around desire, psychology, and personal consent. Popular magazines began publishing essays on contraception, free love, and a woman's right to choose her own partner, ideas that felt almost unthinkable just one decade earlier. Writers like Lu Xun even criticized the old family system directly in their fiction, portraying arranged marriages as quiet tragedies rather than harmless tradition. University campuses in Beijing and Shanghai became hotbeds of debate, with student societies openly discussing gender equality, divorce, and the meaning of romantic love for the first time in a public forum, sometimes even staging plays and public readings built entirely around these controversial new ideas. But something unexpected happened. This sudden new freedom triggered a fierce backlash from conservative families, local officials, and traditionalists who feared the total collapse of social order and ancestral respect. And that wasn't the biggest change. Civil war and foreign invasion were about to interrupt this fragile cultural experiment for 2 entire decades. Everything changed after this. What had been a hopeful conversation about love and freedom was about to be buried underneath one of the most violent and chaotic periods in modern Chinese history. Between 1927 and 1949, China endured brutal civil war, a devastating Japanese occupation, and widespread famine across the countryside. Sexuality was no longer a subject for polite intellectual debate. It became tragically entangled with trauma, forced displacement, and horrific wartime sexual violence that scarred an entire generation of women, especially during the Japanese invasion. Yet strangely, in cosmopolitan port cities like Shanghai, a very different reality existed side by side with immense suffering elsewhere. Shanghai became internationally famous for its nightlife, dance halls, cinema culture, fashionable modern women, and open prostitution, a jarring contrast to the devastation spreading through the countryside. Movie stars and singers became early celebrity icons, appearing on magazine covers in Western-style clothing that would have scandalized their grandparents' generation just decades before, and their glamorous public image stood in sharp, almost surreal contrast to the hardship unfolding just outside the city limits. Meanwhile, in the communist-controlled base areas, far from the glamour of Shanghai, a very different and far stricter model of relationships and discipline was already quietly taking shape among revolutionary soldiers and party cadres preparing for the struggles ahead. But something unexpected happened. In 1949, the Communist Party finally won the long civil war and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China, promising to sweep away everything associated with the old, unequal feudal system. And that wasn't the biggest change. What came next would reshape private, intimate life more completely than any dynasty in Chinese history ever had. Then something happened that nobody in 1949 could have fully predicted. A single new law would touch the private life of nearly every household in the entire country almost overnight. In 1950, the new communist government passed the landmark marriage law, banning arranged marriage, concubinage, and child betrothal outright, while granting women the legal right to freely choose their own spouse and to seek divorce for the first time. For millions of women trapped for years in unwanted arranged marriages, this new law was genuinely revolutionary. And divorce applications reportedly surged across the country almost overnight in some regions. Women entered factories, schools, and public life in numbers never seen before, and state propaganda proudly celebrated the image of the strong, liberated female worker standing shoulder to shoulder with men. Matchmaking still existed informally through work units and neighborhood committees, but for the first time, it required the genuine consent of both partners rather than only their parents, a small but meaningful shift that quietly redefined what marriage was actually supposed to mean. But something unexpected happened. The same government that had just liberated marriage also began tightly regulating sexuality itself, treating premarital relationships, romantic distraction, and homosexuality as dangerous threats to revolutionary discipline and collective productivity. Public discussion of desire and romance quietly began disappearing from mainstream Chinese life. And that wasn't the biggest change. A far stricter, almost completely silent era was approaching, one that would erase sexuality from public view almost entirely for a full decade. The next era would completely rewrite human relationships across the entire country, stripping away nearly every visible trace of romance, fashion, and individual desire from daily public life. During the Cultural Revolution, sexuality became nearly invisible across Chinese public and private life. Fashion turned uniform, shapeless, and strictly utilitarian. Romantic literature was banned or physically destroyed, and public displays of affection were condemned as dangerous symbols of bourgeois corruption and Western decadence. Couples who showed too much emotion in public risked serious political criticism, public denunciation, or far worse consequences. Even something as simple as holding hands in public could draw suspicion from neighbors, co-workers, or local political officials, watching closely for signs of ideological weakness. Millions of young people were sent from the cities to the countryside during this period, separating couples, delaying marriages for years, and forcing an entire generation to postpone their personal lives, their careers, and their families in the name of revolutionary duty and ideological purity. But something unexpected happened. Underground private desire never actually disappeared. It simply went silent, expressed only through secret letters, quiet glances, and carefully hidden relationships that had to survive entirely in the shadows for a decade. And that wasn't the biggest change. When the Cultural Revolution finally ended in 1976, an entirely new era of economic and personal freedom was about to begin, one that would eventually transform China faster than any previous generation could have possibly imagined. But that still wasn't the biggest surprise in this story. The changes coming in the next few decades would move faster, reach further, and touch more private lives than anything that came before them combined. Most people assume China's sexual revolution began with the internet sometime in the 2000s, but historians consistently argue that the real foundation was actually laid decades earlier, in the quiet, cautious economic reforms of the late 1970s, when private life first began carefully separating from total state control after nearly 30 uninterrupted years of strict political oversight over every aspect of daily existence. Without that first cautious opening, none of the freedoms that followed in later decades would have been possible at all. And the entire timeline of modern Chinese dating, marriage, and personal identity would almost certainly look completely different today. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping launched Reform and Opening Up, pushing China firmly toward a market economy and reconnecting the country with the outside world after decades of near-total isolation. As foreign films, magazines, music, and fashion slowly trickled back into daily life, young people began rediscovering romance, personal style, and dating as individual choices, rather than purely political statements. Coastal cities like Guangzhou and the newly created Shenzhen became living laboratories for this cautious new openness, where foreign investment brought not just factories, but also new ideas about consumerism, leisure, personal ambition, and the quiet belief that a better, more comfortable private life might finally be within reach. Dating slowly reappeared as a public, visible activity, with young couples once again seen walking together in parks, cinemas, and newly opened cafes without fear of political criticism or public denunciation. But something unexpected happened. That very same period also introduced the strict one-child policy in 1979, giving the state unprecedented control over reproduction and family planning, even as personal freedoms elsewhere in society were quietly expanding for the first time in decades. And that wasn't the biggest change. A far larger cultural shift was already quietly building throughout the following decade, and that wasn't even close to the biggest transformation still to come. The following decade would bring an explosion of consumer culture, media, and personal expression, unlike anything China had experienced before. Through the 1990s, China's economy boomed at record-breaking speed, cities modernized rapidly, and an entirely new consumer culture emerged almost overnight across the country. Karaoke bars, nightclubs, beauty pageants, and glossy fashion magazines introduced ideas about romance, beauty, and sexuality that would have been genuinely unthinkable just one generation earlier. Divorce rates began climbing steadily year after year. An open discussion of premarital relationships slowly became far more common in major cities like Beijing and Shanghai. Pop music, Hong Kong and Taiwanese television dramas, and imported Western films flooded into households through newly affordable VCRs and cable television, quietly reshaping how an entire generation imagined love, courtship, personal fulfillment, and even what a modern relationship was supposed to look and feel like. But something unexpected happened. Rural China and older generations remained deeply conservative, creating a widening cultural gap between traditional family expectations and fast modernizing urban life. And that wasn't the biggest change. A single new technology was about to erase distance, censorship, and silence almost all at once. Then something happened nobody expected at this scale. A wave of connectivity was about to sweep across the entire country, reaching villages and cities alike within just a few short years. When internet access spread rapidly across China in the early 2000s, everything about private life accelerated at once. Anonymous online forums allowed ordinary people to discuss sex, relationships, and personal identity more openly than at any other point in modern Chinese history. Respected scholars like sociologist Li Yinhe brought serious academic research on sexuality, gender roles, and homosexuality into mainstream national conversation for the very first time, giving these once taboo subjects a real, respected academic voice. Young people used online chat rooms, blogs, and early social networks to explore dating and identity far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns and extended family networks. Viral online discussions about premarital sex, infidelity, and gender roles regularly trended nationwide, forcing even cautious state media outlets to occasionally acknowledge topics that had been quietly avoided in mainstream public conversation for generations before this point. But something unexpected happened. The government simultaneously tightened online censorship, restricting explicit content and closely monitoring conversations about gender and sexuality, even as public curiosity kept quietly growing underground across the country. And that wasn't the biggest change. Smartphones were about to carry this entire quiet revolution directly into everyone's pocket. But the biggest shift still hadn't happened yet. Once every phone became a portable window into private conversation and desire, there was no going back to the silence of previous decades. By the 2010s, smartphones, dating apps, and social platforms completely transformed how young Chinese people met and pursued romantic partners, especially in massive, fast-moving cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen. Attitudes toward premarital sex, cohabitation before marriage, and delaying marriage altogether shifted dramatically among urban youth, even as state television and official media continued promoting traditional family values and filial duty. LGBTQ communities, though still lacking full legal recognition and facing ongoing social and political restrictions, built visible online spaces, support networks, and community events for the very first time in Chinese history. Meanwhile, the concept of the so-called leftover woman entered public discourse, describing educated urban women who chose career and independence over early marriage, sparking heated national debate about changing gender expectations, career ambition, and what a fulfilling life was supposed to look like for a modern Chinese woman. But something unexpected happened. The government simultaneously pushed an increasingly urgent national narrative encouraging marriage and childbirth, deeply worried about falling birth rates and a rapidly aging population straining the economy. And that wasn't the biggest change. A new, deeply contradictory version of China was already quietly emerging beneath the surface. And still, the story wasn't finished. The most contradictory, most complicated chapter of all was only just beginning to unfold in the years right in front of us. Between 2020 and 2026, China entered a strange and delicate balancing act unlike anything before it. On one side, censorship of explicit content, so-called effeminate male imagery, and LGBTQ visibility increased sharply, alongside major state campaigns promoting marriage, childbirth, and traditional family structure as patriotic duty. On the other side, a massive, semi-hidden culture of online dating, private content consumption, and open discussion continued thriving through encrypted apps, coded slang, and closed online communities operating just beneath official notice. Meanwhile, young people increasingly delayed marriage altogether, prioritizing careers, personal independence, and financial security over traditional family pressure and parental expectation, while marriage and birth rates continued falling despite years of state encouragement and financial incentives. Terms like lying flat and the 4-no generation, describing young people rejecting marriage, children, romantic relationships, and even consumerism altogether, spread rapidly across Chinese social media platforms, reflecting a quiet exhaustion with constant pressure from family, employers, and the state alike. But something unexpected happened. Despite tightening official control, public curiosity about sexuality never actually went backward, no matter how strict the new regulations became. And that wasn't the biggest change. The final chapter of this remarkable unfinished story is still being written right now, in real time, by an entire generation. So here we are, right at the edge of the present moment, standing exactly where over a century of transformation has finally brought us, with the next chapter still completely unwritten. From imperial concubines and arranged child marriages, all the way to revolutionary Puritanism and underground silence during the Cultural Revolution. And from cautious economic reform to a wide-open digital present, the story of Chinese sexuality has quietly touched nearly every part of the nation's modern history. From Deng Xiaoping's cautious economic opening to a booming, chaotic early internet culture. From smartphone dating apps to today's strange, contradictory mix of tightening censorship and quiet, persistent curiosity, Chinese sexuality has never once stood completely still for very long. Every single generation inherited the fears, silences, and heavy restrictions of the one before it. And yet every generation still found new, creative ways to quietly break a few more rules than the last, whether through poetry, protest, private letters, or simply a closed bedroom door kept shut. Today, China stands at yet another historical crossroads, torn between a government that wants social stability, order, and firm control, and a younger generation that increasingly wants personal freedom, privacy, and honest self-expression. Artificial intelligence, virtual companionship, and constant global connectivity are already reshaping intimacy and relationships in ways no emperor, revolutionary leader, or 20th century reformer could have ever possibly imagined just a few decades ago. And whatever comes next will be shaped not by decree from above, but by millions and millions of individual choices made quietly, privately, one relationship at a time. Chinese sexuality has never stayed the same. For over a century, from the fall of an ancient empire to the rise of artificial intelligence, it has evolved again and again alongside the nation itself, shaped by revolution. Silence, technology, censorship, economic transformation, and quiet, persistent rebellion passed down from one generation to the next. No dynasty, no ideology, and no amount of control has ever fully succeeded in silencing human desire for very long. The question is, what will the next 100 years truly actually look like, and who will be the ones writing that story? If you found this journey through history fascinating, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden stories that shape the modern world. And let us know in the comments which era of this incredible unfinished transformation surprised you the most, and which one you think still deserves its own full episode.